This is our second recorded discussion on Beowulf. Would the summarizer please give their summary?
Yeah, so at the beginning of our reading, Beowulf tells Hrothgar that his men and him feel that it is time to go home. And so Beowulf bids farewell and thanks the king for his hospitality and claiming that he will always be willing to aid the Danes. Hrothgar can't thank the hero enough and gives him 12 treasures. The king says they should meet again, but knows they won't, and cries for Beowulf's departure. He also says that there's a great friendship between the two nations. Then the men sailed home, and upon their return, the Geatish king holds a feast to welcome back the men. Beowulf tells of his tales. He gives some treasures to the king, and the king gives Beowulf some treasures and land back. The narrator then briefly summarizes the next 50 years. The Geatish king died at the hands of the enemy, and Beowulf became king, where he ruled wisely. Then the narrator tells the story of how a slave happened across a barrow where a dragon was hoarding his treasure and stole a goblet which infuriated the dragon. The hoard was left behind by an ancient race. So that was the summary I had.
So why do you think the author chose to skip and briefly summarize the 50 years?
Yeah, it was really a strange transition from it was telling the story of Beowulf's adventures, kind of day by day. It was a slow progression, then all of a sudden, one line later, we're 50 years in the future, and it was a very stark contrast that was wait, what just happened? Why do you think he chose to do that?
I think it sets a mood of peace. This is when Beowulf is taking off, adventuring and taking time to just rule his nation instead of going out on adventures, because he already had them. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And if he had included everything between 50 years, I feel the poem would be longer.
Yeah.
And it's really showing that he hasn't really been doing anything except for being king, because nothing's been happening compared to Grendel or his mom. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it shows that there's peace around during his reign, maybe.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the author chooses to do that because later in the story, we have more action that will happen, and in that moment is kind of a resting place, so that there wasn't always danger around. And so it just makes it that much more significant later in the story.
Yeah, I think it's the author has two stories to tell. The one about Beowulf fighting Grendel, and then the one later about fighting the dragon, and then that this is he doesn't want to tell the what happens in between them.
Yeah. Also, I think he wants to emphasize on the fact that Beowulf became king, and that didn't happen right away after. Or did it? I don't think it did.
Yeah, it's been a few years.
Well, it happened during the 50 or so years.
Yeah. So.
It says that the Geatish king died in battle, and that Beowulf succeeded him to the throne.
Yeah.
Okay, so the passage analysis.
My first passage is from page 91. It states, "In your royal name, to take my chances underwater, to win glory and to win my worth." This shows human nature during this period was to seek glory and become powerful, although most of the time it was achieved through battles and killing the enemy. So basically I just thought that this quote shows that human nature of people during this time period. Okay.
Yeah, I think it's important to also see they seek that glory and power through these adventures and victories, and then they get rewarded, as Beowulf was, with treasures and land. So that's what shows their worth, and that was what the men of that time period were all about, was getting that land and that recognition and that treasure, because that's what signified was successful back then.
I think it's interesting because you say that their main goal is to like become wealthy and honorable and have their name known around the world, and that like the way they get that is different from how we think of things. Like they have to fight like creatures and go into battle, and like the way we do that now is just like we don't really do that. You know what I mean?
No.
Yeah, but I feel like they have to like seek adventure, and I think now if you want something in life, you have to go get it. Like, so it kind of can relate.
And I think like that has transitioned because we don't live in a feudal society anymore, where where we live in a constant small community that's constantly battling other communities. Like, we live in a safe country. We don't have to fear attack in our homeland. So it's kind of a different aspect in that sense. And then, like, with the introduction of currency over the centuries, like, now that's more commonly how wealth and success is gauged, is through that currency instead of maybe the amount of land you own or the amount of gold you own.
I think there's more opportunity too, because back then you were, I don't know if they still had like classes, but
They would.
they did, but like if you were born king, then you were king, and the
Mhm.
only way to like raise your station would be to do what Beowulf did, because he like saved everyone, so then everyone knows him. Whereas today, if you're like, you can just do something else. You
And
don't find.
And I mean, in that society, only men had an opportunity to be successful. Like, women kind of just, they were as successful as their husbands were, even less, to a lesser degree. They didn't have any chance to earn their own fame and recognition.
Yeah, the only way they could define themselves really was to marry like someone of a high status.
Yep.
I can share, I know we're not on this, but I can share like my question that related to women.
Yeah.
I think.
Do you want to say something first?
Oh yeah, I kind of disagreed with what you were saying about like how you can become more powerful in today's world if you want to. Like it was born, because like if you're born into like you have the opportunity to become better today, but like if you're born in a poor community like Detroit or something, there's really no escape from that poor school system and getting yourself out of that world. Like it's really difficult. So
There's a poverty cycle, but I still think that though it's very unlikely, it's still possible in today's society. Like,
I agree with Abby, but I think that back to what I said earlier, like if you want something in the society that we live in, you have to try to get it. You can't just hope for the best. So a lot of people will try to have success, even if it's not given to them, just like people would go out and adventure and try to gain their fame. Even though it doesn't always work out now, it didn't always work out back then either.
Do you want me to share my question?
Yeah, you can share your question that relates to this subject.
Okay, so I had how do cultural and personal values intersect in epics, and I found two passages about women's roles. A queen should weave peace, not punish the innocent. And sometimes Hrothgar's daughter distributed ale to older ranks in order to the benches, on the benches. And I just feel like that shows high status, what the expectations were for high status women.
Yeah.
Because usually in history you talk about like the peasants, but like there's a lot about high status women that were different but the same for both peasants. Because it always talks about the queen being in gold, but at the same time she's not as free as she could be or probably wants to be. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
yeah,
I agree with that.
more of a symbol. than like a powerful woman.
Yeah, she was like a symbol of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to like.
Yeah. Okay. So what was your? You have another passage, right?
Yeah, mine says, even an outstanding queen, or, even a queen outstanding in beauty must not overstep like that. A queen should have weave peace and not punish the innocent. And this quote just shows that every person has evil to them, even like a queen, and I feel like that shows the human nature of just each person, and we all have a bad side to us. So
Yeah, I think it's important to note that like when we think of this time, we might think of these people as kind of like savage, and how they're always warring people and they have no moral code. But then you look at this passage and you realize, well, they do have a moral code. They do expect people to act in a certain manner that is reasonable and doesn't put other people in harm.
and also, I mean, even though Beowulf was like wanting his own glory, he was fighting for another country that wasn't even his. So I mean, and they had like a bad history and whatnot of arguments and whatnot. So
Yeah. So I mean, it wasn't just people killing each other, all for whatever, for kicks or whatever, but they do have a moral code, and I think that's maybe growing more as they like become more Christian, because you can still see like these Christian influences in Beowulf's writing. He mentions God a good bit, and I think that's starting to affect their moral code as a society.
I feel like when I was reading this book, like so far up to this point, I've noticed that the societies within it have a huge like respect for like justice. Like it doesn't matter like how it's brought about. Like even if it like means killing someone, they just want things to be like, oh, you did this to me. Well, I'm gonna do this back, and then I'm gonna gain my revenge, or I'm gonna gain justice, and I'm gonna make it right. So a lot of people did use that sort of killing and things like that to bring that about, and that's probably why we see it as such a ruthless society at some times.
They still use that system of eye for an eye, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so if that's, and we see that as being like, that's too harsh. That's not fair, because today we have like the courts and stuff, but even then, like, I don't know, which one do you think would be more fair, like the eye for an eye or like the courts, like the way we do it now?
I mean, we might be biased because we live in
Yeah.
a system where it's no longer an eye for an eye, but I think it's more fair in the sense that it gives people a second chance.
It gives people their humanity.
Yeah.
Because without the courts, we wouldn't be able to see past their deed at the person. We would solely look at the horrible thing or whatever they have done, and we would think, oh my gosh, well, you deserve this, and we would just give them what we think they deserve when we really don't know the full story.
Okay, I have like the how does an epic.
Okay, you can go on to.
Yeah, we can go on.
Yes.
So, as for the how is an epic the story of a nation, I had the passage of what you have done is draw two peoples, the Geat nation and us neighboring Danes, and epics are really important in telling the story of a nation because it tells like the origin of nations and like their history, or it reflects their history.
It also tells us a lot about their societal values, their culture.
yeah, it shows like it showed like the feud between the Danes and whatever.
The neighboring feudal societies.
Yeah, and then they allied and got over it. So
Like how two countries can be at war but then find peace.
similar to like I guess you could say like